Hello and good morning. My name is Thomas Summers and I am the acting chairman of the Defense Nuclear Facility Safety Board. I will preside over today's public meeting. With me today are my colleagues on the board, Board Member Jesse Roberson and Board Member Joyce Connery. We three constitute the board. Having established a quorum of board members, this public meeting will now come to order. Kevin Liskowski, the board's general counsel, will serve as the board's executive secretary for the meeting. This public meeting was announced on October 27th, 2020, on the board's public website. It was also subsequently noticed in the Federal Register on December the 1st. The board has voted to hold this public meeting pursuant to the Government in the Sunshine Act, the board's implementation regulations for the Government in the Sunshine Act, and the board's operating procedures. The objective of this public meeting is for the board to receive a staff briefing regarding the board's revision or reaffirmation of Recommendation 2020-1. During the staff briefing and upon its completion, board members may deliberate on any appropriate follow-on actions for Recommendation 2020-1. On February 21st of this year, the board transmitted Recommendation 2020-1 regarding nuclear safety requirements at defense nuclear facilities. The Department of Energy responded by letter on June 11th. DOE's response indicated partial acceptance of 3 sub-recommendations and rejection of the other 8 sub-recommendations. Currently, the board's obligation under the Atomic Energy Act is to either confirm or revise these sub-recommendations in light of what we heard from the Department of Energy. To help the board decide, our staff will take us through each sub-recommendation to describe and assess what we heard from the Department of Energy. Before we get started, board members will have an opportunity for opening remarks, after which I will turn things over to our technical director, Christopher Rossetti, to provide an overview of the entire recommendation. Now, my opening remarks. I joined the board in August of 2020 and have thoroughly reviewed and am very familiar with the recommendation and underlying basis. I am completely open to considering the most recent information from the staff about the recommendation and its importance to safety at defense nuclear facilities. I will now turn to my other board members for their opening remarks. Ms. Roberson?
Thank you, Mr. Summers. I want to thank my fellow board members for supporting this open meeting and our staff for the long hours and tireless efforts to prepare for and participate in it. I supported this recommendation and I look forward to seeing if there's additional information from our staff or in regards to DOE's response to the recommendation. I want to thank members of the public for signing on and supporting our commitment to continue forging forward and executing our safety oversight mission, even under these challenging circumstances. I am looking forward to our discussion and deliberations regarding DOE's response to DNFSB recommendation 20-1. Thank you, Mr. Summers. That ends my comments.
Thank you, Ms. Roberson. Ms. Connery.
Thank you, Mr. Summers. I appreciate the opportunity to provide my opening remarks, which seem to have gone away. First of all, I'd like to reiterate the thanks to those of you who joined the meeting today, and note that we have a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to try to keep my remarks relatively short, which is a feat for those of you who know me. I thought I'd take a few minutes to explain why we're having a public meeting in this unusual format. The reason for the format is fairly self-evident. We're in the midst of a public health crisis, and it would be reckless to hold an in-person public event at this time. So we're taking advantage of technology to hold it virtually. We don't often hold public meetings just amongst the board members and the staff on technical issues. We've had public hearings regarding technical matters, and recently we've had a DOE participation in public meetings to answer questions about previous recommendations. In this case, as Mr. Summers described, we had a recommendation that we issued on February 2020, entitled Nuclear Safety Requirements, and we received a response from the department in June that essentially rejected the majority of the board's sub-recommendations. This was without substantive rebuttal, but citing the fact that there was an ongoing rulemaking effort and that our recommendations either were within the scope of that rulemaking and thus they were precluded from commenting, or they were outside of the scope of rulemaking and thus they were precluded from commenting. The board addressed this unusual response in a letter to the secretary this past September as we considered next steps. Between receiving the department's response and now, Chairman Hamilton departed our agency and our newest board member, Mr. Summers, became our acting chair. As this is our first public meeting and since his onboarding, I'd just like to publicly recognize him and welcome him formally and publicly to the board. With a new board configuration and a response from the department that did not address our recommendations or technical issues underpinning those recommendations, the board determined the best way to consider reaffirmation of the recommendation was through deliberation, and that meant a public meeting as required by the Sunshine Act. Additionally, since we issued our recommendations, we have received several requests from interest groups and congressional staff regarding the nature and the content of our recommendation. Through this process, we thought we could help shed some light on the original recommendation, its purpose, the staff's evaluation of the now published 10 CFR 830 rule, and if and how it addresses any of the board's concerns. One final note. While discussions regarding safety rules, orders, directives, and standards may seem less tangible than discussing potential accident scenarios at defense nuclear facilities in which workers and public would be subjected to radiological uptake, these discussions are no less important to public health and safety. In fact, those rules and standards and their proper implementation provide the basis to allow the Secretary to understand the magnitude of risk to public health and safety associated with DOE's defense nuclear facilities. The Atomic Energy Act states that the board shall review and evaluate the content and implementation of standards, including all applicable Department of Energy's orders, regulations, and requirements. And throughout the board's history, it has been a continuous theme that the department has long manifested an expert-based culture rather than a standards-based culture to the detriment of safety. Jack Crawford, one of our esteemed former board members, even went so far as to state that the department suffered a mentality and a culture that tended to deprecate the need for standards. While I believe the department has come a long way in the movement toward a more standards-based culture, we must remain vigilant against any backslide in this regard. And I would ask you to view these proceedings with that in mind. With that, that concludes my opening remarks. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ms. Connery. This concludes the board's opening remarks. At this time, I'd like to begin with Mr. Rossetti. Mr. Rossetti will now walk us through how we got here in more detail. Mr. Rossetti.
Slide 1, please. Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Summers, Ms. Roberson, and Ms. Connery. My name is Christopher Rossetti, and I'm the board's technical director. Slide 2, please. At today's public meeting, the staff will discuss Recommendation 2020-1, Nuclear Safety Requirements, including the department's response to the recommendation, actions the department has taken that relate to specific issues identified by the board, and a current staff assessment of those issues. The meeting is organized as shown here. I will begin with a discussion of the circumstances that led to the board's recommendation and provide some perspective on the recommendation's overall goal and relevance to safety. At that point, I will hand the discussion over to other members of the board's technical staff to provide more detailed discussions of specific sub-recommendation topic areas. During the staff presentations, the board members will ask the staff any clarifying questions they may have to aid in their deliberations. Slide 3, please. Recommendation 2020-1 focused on the requirements established by the department for the safe operation of its defense nuclear facilities, As the owner of these facilities, the department is responsible for ensuring its defense nuclear facilities are designed, constructed, operated, and decommissioned in a manner that provides for adequate protection of the public, the worker, and the environment. To achieve this, the department establishes requirements for its operating contractors to follow and implement. Among these requirements are those that relate to nuclear facility safety bases, where contractors define the scope of work to be performed at the facility, identify and analyze the hazards associated with the work, and establish controls that provide the basis for ensuring safety. As the facility owner, the department approves the safety basis, and any facility operation by the contractor must be under the auspices of a DOE-approved safety basis. In the DOE complex, an approved safety basis is akin to a license to operate. The department then ensures contractor compliance with safety requirements via both line management and independent oversight mechanisms. 10 CFR 830 Nuclear Safety Management is the foundation of the department's regulatory framework for ensuring the health and safety of the public. In particular, Subpart B of the rule contains requirements pertaining to nuclear facility safety bases. In 2018, the department started the process to revise 10 CFR 830. Before I move on from this slide, I will note for the benefit of the public that the board has posted on its website an acronym list for key terms that may come up during this public meeting. These materials can be found in the public hearings and meetings section of the board's website, www.dnfsb.gov. Slide 4, please. Since the safety basis requirements of the rule were published in 2001, DOE's defense nuclear facilities have grown older and more complex. However, the department's proposed revision to 10 CFR 830 relaxed or eliminated requirements rather than reinforcing and clarifying its regulatory framework. For example, both the board and the department have identified recurring problems with the development, review, and approval of quality safety basis documents. Despite this, the department eliminated a requirement for federal employees to perform an annual review and approval of safety basis rather than investigating and addressing underlying implementation causes. In the revision to the rule, the department also did not incorporate key nuclear safety concepts and important lessons learned developed and gathered over the past 20 years of facility design, construction, operation, and decommissioning. For example, specific administrative controls and the concept of defense in depth are important parts of the department's approach to nuclear safety, but do not have firmly established requirements in 10 CFR 830. As stated in the department's notice of proposed rulemaking, the intent of the proposed revision of 10 CFR 830 was to, quote, enhance operational efficiency while maintaining robust safety performance, end quote. Upon review of the draft rule, the board was concerned that rather than enhancing safety, the revision was an example of a broader erosion in the department's nuclear safety regulatory framework. Slide 5, please. Here's an overview of key actions and communications by the department and the board regarding the revision to 10 CFR 830 and the development of Recommendation 2020-1. Of note, the timeline covers a period of over 2 years. The board first sent comments to the department on the draft 10 CFR 830 in October 2018. A year later, the board sent draft Recommendation 2020-1 to the department. During that time, the department did not formally respond to the board's comments. The board transmitted its final Recommendation 2020-1 in February of 2020. In June, the department responded with a rejection of a majority of the sub-recommendations. Although the department published the entire rule as part of the NOPR, it only intended to address specific changes it described in the NOPR. Thus, the department rejected some sub-recommendations because the department was considering those matters in the rulemaking. The department rejected other sub-recommendations because it was considering those sub-recommendations as outside the scope of the rulemaking. In its response to the board's recommendation, the department did not provide substantive discussion or technical disagreement with the sub-recommendations that it rejected. In the few instances in which the department partially accepted a sub-recommendation, it is not clear whether the department is proposing a path forward that would address the board's concern. In some of those cases, the department said it would do its own evaluation to determine whether improvements are necessary. Slide 6, please. Recommendation 2020-1 is intended to strengthen the department's regulatory framework in its current form, including the department's orders and standards. The recommendation also seeks to maintain and improve federal accountability mechanisms and fundamental nuclear safety processes that were potentially undermined by the department's revision to 10 CFR 830. The defense nuclear complex continues to age, and the department has recognized the challenges associated with managing its aging facilities. The department needs to maintain a robust safety posture and strong regulatory framework to ensure that its aging facilities and infrastructure and its new facilities provide adequate protection of public health and safety. The department will need clear requirements and guidance for federal staff to follow and enforce. Specifically, the regulatory framework lacks sufficient requirements to ensure consistent and appropriate implementation across the complex for unreviewed safety questions, technical safety requirements, specific administrative controls, and the defense in-depth construct. To accomplish these goals, Recommendation 2020-1 included sub-recommendations in 4 key areas as shown here: aging infrastructure, hazard categories, DOE approvals, and the safety basis process and requirements. Before proceeding through the rest of the staff presentations, I turn to Mr. Summers for any board member questions or comments.
Thank you, Mr. Rossetti. I'll ask my fellow board members if they have any comments. Ms. Roberson, any comments or questions, ma'am?
No, Mr. Summers, I don't have any questions or comments for Mr. Rossetti at this time.
Thank you very much. Ms. Connery, any comments or questions, ma'am?
Yeah, I have two questions, Chris. So one is, given the board's statutory role with regards to rulemaking and standards, was the board staff involved in the drafting of the draft rulemaking?
I just want to clarify, you're talking about the draft rulemaking from a couple years ago, not the original draft rulemaking?
Sorry, 10 CFR 830, yeah, 2018. So in your slide, when you gave the timeline, which I don't know if Katie can pull up. Yeah, so it says that in August, the DOE published its intent to change 10 CFR 830, and then we sent comments to the draft rule. While they were developing the draft rule, did we have the opportunity to provide input through basically board to DOE?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. I understand the question now. So I cannot comment on any discussions the previous technical director may have had with Department of Energy staff regarding the rulemaking, because I only became the technical director in June of 2018. So there wasn't much time from the August NOPR to previously when I was the technical director. But from when I became the technical director through this whole process, the only interactions that the board and the board staff have had regarding comments on the rule was the submission of the staff's comments via the Federal Register process through the website. Those comments were approved by the board, and then those same comments were transmitted by the board as an enclosure to the secretary via board letter. And that was the October 5th, 2018, as shown on the slide, the public comment and board letter to the department. There may have been some informal staff to staff conversations, but not like our normal process of reviewing directives and submitting comments. And as this is the rule from which all the department's directives, orders, standards, manuals, guides on safety at defense nuclear facilities flow. It was, I think it would have been beneficial for the department to reach out more formally to gain the board's insight on the topics that were included in the recommendation and in the comments the board submitted.
When we submitted public comment, how were those treated? Were they treated as their oversight agency, or were they treated as members of the public? How were they characterized?
So I actually was the one who submitted them through the Federal Register website on behalf of the board. I'm not sure that they were treated any differently from any other comments that were submitted. So when you ask if they were treated as if coming from the oversight agency, I can't say whether they were or were not, but that's partly why the board followed up with a letter to the secretary, which also garnered no response.
Understood. One final question. I'm sorry to belabor the point. So you noted that you thought that the revised rule was an example of an erosion in DOE's regulatory framework. And I think that's a pretty powerful statement. So I'm just wondering how this relates to other trends that you and the staff have seen across the complex.
Yes, ma'am. So I have a few examples. The first is from 2017 when the department revised its order 232.2, which is the occurrence reporting and processing order. It actually was started at the end of calendar year 2016, and it was signed in 2017. They actually used a pilot process to revise this order, which used an integrated project team consisted of members of the federal staff and contractor staff to look at this order. The board actually sent a letter on this to the secretary around mid-2017 to re-emphasize that the board disagreed with removing the requirement to report potential inadequacies in the safety analysis. And then there were also deletion of requirements regarding timely notification of final report. So those are two highlights from the board's letter about that revision. In 2019, Standard 1158, which is the self-assessment standard for Department of Energy contractor criticality safety programs, was essentially archived. This standard at the time was not consistent with the ANSI ANS 819 standards. At the staff level, I know we had communications that suggested that they should revise that standard to come in compliance with ANSI and ANS 819, but they canceled it instead. And again, the board advised the secretary about incorporating information from that archive standard into an active directive. Most recently, the board provided the secretary Tech Report 45, which is violations of the nuclear safety basis. And that found that the declaring and reporting of TSR violations, technical safety report violations, it was inconsistent and lacked from clear requirements and guidance across the complex. So those are three examples from recently where the staff has seen requirements and guidance regarding safety at defense nuclear facilities be reduced or eliminated.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Mr. Rossetti. No further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ms. Connery, for your questions, and appreciate your responses, Mr. Rossetti. So I'll turn it back over to you, Mr. Rossetti, for our first presenter. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So now members of the board's technical staff will go through the 4 sub-recommendation areas. First will be Douglas Minima to cover aging infrastructure. Then Michael Dunleavy will discuss hazard categories. Then Jason Anderson will cover DOE approvals. And finally, Robert Oberruder will discuss safety basis, process, and requirements. So Dr. Minima, I now turn it over to you to discuss aging infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Rossetti, and good morning, Chairman Summers and board members Roberson and Connery. I am Doug Minima, and I am a member of the technical staff. I'm going to speak to you today about the first sub-recommendation of Recommendation 2020-1 on aging infrastructure. In this discussion, I will provide some background on why the recommendation addressed aging infrastructure, the specifics of the sub-recommendation, DOE's response to the sub-recommendation, and the staff's evaluation of DOE response. If I could have slide 8, please. Thank you. For the years 2016 through 2019, DOE developed and released an annual report on the state of its general purpose infrastructure. As part of DOE's evaluation of its infrastructure, the program offices identified specific and unique capabilities that directly support and enable their programs to meet their mission requirements. DOE considers a core capability to be potentially at risk if 25% or more of the total replacement plant value associated with that capability is assessed as inadequate. The 2019 General Purpose Infrastructure Report states that 5 of the core capabilities related to defense nuclear facility operations are potentially at risk from inadequate infrastructure. Those core capabilities are 1, federal management and oversight, 2, nuclear material accountability, storage, protection, and handling, 3, plutonium, 4, uranium, and 5, weapons assembly and disassembly. In addition to the potential risks in its core capabilities, DOE's level of deferred maintenance hovers at about $6 billion a year right now and is nearly 3 times its annual operating and maintenance costs. And the average age of its facilities and supporting systems is approaching 40 years. Slide 9, please. In the past several years, the board has communicated a number of issues to DOE associated with age-related degradation at DOE sites. I have provided a few examples here, including nuclear facility buildings and equipment being used far beyond their useful life, safety-related systems being supported by general purpose infrastructure, and corroded components in fire suppression systems. DOE has made some efforts to address aging infrastructure issues, such as NNSA's extended life program at the Y-12 site and their deep dive infrastructure reviews at other NNSA sites. However, the magnitude of the problem is significant and there is no quick solution. For example, NNSA's Strategic Integrated Roadmap of May 2019 sets the following targets. By 2025, NNSA intends to reduce deferred maintenance by about 30%. By 2038, NNSA intends to modernize the utilities across its sites. By 2043, NNSA plans to complete the construction or modernization of 10 million gross square feet of office and laboratory space. Regardless of the individual efforts of the program offices to begin addressing aging infrastructure, there is no regulatory framework of department-wide policies and requirements to ensure that the efforts will be completed. Furthermore, there are no department-wide priorities, guidance, and practices in place to ensure a consistent approach to addressing the problem. Slide 10, please. For these reasons, in 2018, the board felt it was necessary to include a general comment regarding the challenge DOE faces from aging infrastructure and the need for a formal regulatory structure to address it in the board's October 5, 2018 letter to the Secretary conveying its comments on the proposed revision of 10 CFR 830. In the absence of a response from DOE to the October 2018 letter and the board's continuing observations of age-related degradation in DOE defense nuclear facilities, the board considered that a sub-recommendation on aging infrastructure should be included in recommendation 2020-1. If I may have slide 11, please. In its response to the recommendation, DOE partially accepted this recommendation. DOE rejected the recommended action of establishing an approach including requirements to aging management. However, DOE stated that it will, and I quote, ensure that nuclear safety is appropriately considered within existing organizations and committees in the department who are charged with establishing department-wide priorities and providing recommendations regarding infrastructure, end quote. DOE also noted that it is involved in the development of an American Nuclear Society standard addressing the issue of aging management, but DOE provided no information as to how it might apply the standard when it is completed. Slide 12, please. The organizations and committees referred to in DOE's response are established by DOE's directives on real property asset management. I've listed these committees and organizations here. All three committees are composed of senior federal leaders with appropriate responsibilities and authorities, and with a few contractor representatives in support roles with limited authorities. The board staff reviewed the charters, membership minutes, and products of these organizations and committees to evaluate their role in, quote, establishing department-wide priorities and providing recommendations regarding infrastructure, end quote. Slide 13, please. After reviewing the committee charters, agendas, and reports, the board staff found that one committee meets routinely, the second committee has at least temporarily ceased functioning since October of 2019, and the third committee solely focuses on preparing a biennial report mandated by Congress in 2016. It is difficult to fully assess the functioning of these committees without recorded meeting minutes, but based on available agendas and reports, the staff determined that the committees primarily collected information and reported on the current status of general purpose infrastructure to DOE's senior leaders. However, these committees did not appear to provide formal advice on priorities or methodologies on how the department should manage its aging infrastructure. Slide 14, please. At the department level, department-wide level, the Infrastructure Management Director is focused on establishing high-level expectations for the program offices to follow and informing the senior leadership of the status of the infrastructure supporting DOE's missions and property assets. Decisions on building, decommissioning, refurbishing, maintaining, and upgrading individual properties are generally made at the program office levels. Age and condition of facilities are only two of many considerations in those decisions. However, there are no explicit requirements or guidance addressing the management of aging facilities. Furthermore, there is a significant difference between infrastructure management and aging management. Aging management takes a focused view on the effects of aging on the materials, structures, and behaviors of the infrastructure component being relied on. Key tools used in aging management, such as predictive models of age-related degradation, component and system surveillance is specific to detecting age-related degradation, reliability analysis, and other processes are not normally relied on for property asset management, but are key to aging management. Other federal and international agencies with responsibility for nuclear safety, such as the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the International Atomic Energy Agency, have explicit requirements and guidance for aging management programs. In the staff's opinion, the board's concern expressed in sub-recommendation 1 remains. The staff does not believe that DOE's proposed remedy will be sufficient to address the concern. That is the end of my prepared remarks. Are there any questions?
Thanks, Dr. Minima. Sir, before I turn over to my fellow board members for their comments or questions, I do have one question, and that is in reference to on slide 13, I believe, where you had said and talked about some of the perspectives as far as balancing between mission accomplishment and safety, especially from a perspective in which the aging infrastructure and aging buildings from that perspective. So in your opinion, and from what you have researched for a long time, does it appear that DOE is striking a reasonable balance between mission accomplishment and safety, especially at these older infrastructure facilities? Or, slightly said differently, are they ensuring the adequate protection and safety at these DOE defense facilities?
Thank you for the question. That's an interesting question. My initial response would be to say that it really varies somewhat on whether you're looking at an NNSA site or EM site. EM, I think, understands that their entire portfolio of property is aged facilities, and yet they have to be able to maintain an infrastructure around them until they can clean them up. So I think in EM, there is a recognition that safety and mission are necessarily the same. In NNSA, I do not want to say that they discount safety, but I think there is very strong mission pressure on them to accomplish the mission, and that their view of infrastructure management tends to focus more on the infrastructure's ability to support the mission. I think they will tell you that safety is in there because they expect to do the mission safely, but as I have not seen as much of an explicit perspective of viewing safety as equal to mission. I will also comment that's my personal view.
Understood. Appreciate your comment and your answer, sir.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And now I'll turn it over for any questions or comments from my fellow board members. Ms. Roberson?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Summers. And thank you, Dr. Minima, for your presentation. So I do have a couple of questions. Bear with me. I hope they're clear. So even though it appears these committees that DOE offered in response to the board's concerns don't actually do the things that would address the board concerns vis-a-vis establishing some consistent requirements for aging management and the department's important facilities and operations. Did DOE communicate with the staff in any way as to whether they're going to change the purpose of these committees? Do we know if they actually intend to revise what they've been doing since they offered them up to address this specific concern?
We have gotten no further information from DOE beyond what's in the response itself on that issue. I can't speak to what their intent is. All I can say is that their comment was that they would make sure that they appropriately consider aging infrastructure within their actions.
Thank you, sir. So one of the other things that you referenced was the aging management program at Y12, which in my recollection is the board has previously, in correspondence to the department, recommend that the department take a look at something like that complex wide, not necessarily saying that is the only way to approach it. So you correct me, I don't think it's the first time that the board has actually raised this topic and issue formally with the department's leadership. Is my recollection correct?
That is absolutely correct. And in fact, I believe it was slide, excuse me, on slide 9, where I talked about previous communications. The Y12 Extended Life Program is one of those communications, but there have been a number of communications. In some cases, we have talked about the programs for managing aging infrastructure, and in other cases, we have talked about specific examples where aging infrastructure is impeding the DOE's ability to perform work safely. But yes, we have suggested that they take a look at Y12's Extended Life Program. I will say that what we have been looking at so far and what I have talked about in this presentation is at the department-wide level. We intend to go down further and look at the individual programs, EM and NNSA, and look at how they are managing it. But the board's concern was with the department-wide level and the establishment of consistent requirements. And so we focused on that in order to answer these questions, and we'll continue to look further down and see what is being done at the program office level.
Okay, and just one more question so that I don't hog all the time. So we very much like the department also keep an eye on when the department invests or should invest in new infrastructure, whether it's waste treatment plant at Hanford, tritium facilities at Savannah River, uranium processing facility at Y12, and others at Los Alamos. And I guess what I'm wondering is, I mean, these are important initiatives, and the board has spoken out in many cases in support of them. But we also recognize that many of them are decades of the making, and in some cases get rescoped. And when you think you're going to not need an aging facility, you end up changing the scope of the future new facility so that you still need, you rely on the aging facility. So do any of these committees that the department held up connect proposed new infrastructure and continued operations in aged facilities even from an infrastructure management perspective? Do we know?
I think that the answer to the question is that's really outside of the role of these particular committees. That would be at the program office level. Now, what these committees are basically doing is accumulating the information, collecting information from the various program offices about the status of their facilities and elevating that to provide a department-wide perspective. And so, but the decisions on whether to maintain, replace a facility is done at the program level. So the individuals in these committees are involved in that, but the committees themselves are not actually looking at that as part of their responsibility.
Okay, and last question, I apologize. It's in regard to the ANSI standard. If we accept that the ANSI standard might provide a platform for the department to address the issue of requirements for aging management, what's the time frame of that? Do we have any sense? What does it mean? It's a standard. Department, I think you said they didn't say anything about actually implementing or timing.
I don't have an answer for that. I think one of the other staff members has a better feel for that. We do have a staff member that is involved in that, in the development of that standard, and so we are watching the development. But I personally do not know the schedule right now.
Okay, thank you, sir. No more comments from me, Mr. Summers.
Thank you very much, Ms. Roberson. Ms. Connery, do you have any comments or questions, ma'am?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. So I know that Congress in particular tends to focus on the deferred maintenance issue. And I think your comment said that they would reduce deferred maintenance, or the goal is to reduce deferred maintenance by 30% by 2025. That feels like it's just treading water. And if the trajectory is that the maintenance will increase as time goes on, that means that they're not going to catch up anytime soon. So I was just hoping that you would comment on that and the implications for safety. And then, further to that, is deferred maintenance, I mean, that seems like one aspect of aging infrastructure that folks are focused on, but it doesn't seem to be definitive when it comes to the safety of the facilities or the safety systems that may be aging and have difficulties with replacement components, et cetera.
I think the first thing I would say is that treading water is probably the right phrase to use. As I don't know the way the current budget is, priorities are established, but in 2016, according to one of the general purpose infrastructure reports, actually, in 2016, the guidance for budget preparation was changed to ensure that the deferred maintenance cost stayed level, that it did not increase further. They wanted the program offices to increase their operating maintenance budget to allow so that they didn't have any further increase. For the couple of years of data that is available, it does appear that works. But I should note also that the biggest thing that helps them on deferred maintenance is when EM decommissions or deactivates a facility such that it no longer needs maintenance. They can then write off that deferred maintenance cost. And so you do see some adjustments from year to year from that. I mean, in real dollars, they're significant, like maybe $100 million in one case or another. But in terms of the $6 billion that you have sitting there right now, or of cost, it's not a huge decrease in the total. I will also say that it is hard, given the data we have right now, and I don't know if better data is available, but given the data we have right now, it is very hard to determine the safety significance of that deferred maintenance. The sense we have is that deferred maintenance is probably managed better at defense nuclear facilities than other facilities, but that's really a perception that we don't have good data on that either. So I really can't speak. One would have to assume that there is a safety penalty associated with a high level of deferred maintenance, but I can't speak to exactly how bad it is.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Connery, and thank you, Dr. Minima. At this time, I'd like to turn it back over to Mr. Rossetti for our second presenter. Mr. Rossetti.
Thank you, Mr. Summers. We will now hear from Michael Dunleavy to discuss hazard categorizations. Mr. Dunleavy.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. My name is Michael Dunleavy, and I am a member of the board's technical staff. Today, I'm here to brief you on the hazard categorization sub-recommendations of Recommendation 2020-1. Slide 16, please. Before we dive into the details, I would like to give some background on what the hazard categorization process is and why it matters. DOE uses the hazard categorization process to group nuclear facilities based on the severity of potential radiological accidents. As Table 1 shows, DOE has multiple categories of facilities. Hazard Category 1 facilities represent the highest radiological hazard and has the potential for significant off-site consequences. Below Hazard Category 3 facilities represent the lowest radiological hazard for DOE facilities. DOE uses the hazard categorization of a facility to apply a graded approach, which helps inform them of the level of rigor and detail required when preparing a facility's safety basis. For example, the level of analysis and evaluation of hazards and controls for a Hazard Category 3 facility may be less than that of a Hazard Category 2 facility. Further, 10 CFR 830 does not require a documented safety analysis for below Hazard Category 3 facilities. So the level of analysis and rigor for this type of facility is significantly less than that of a Hazard Category 3 facility. Accordingly, it is important that facilities are appropriately categorized in order to ensure that a facility's hazards are properly analyzed and an adequate control set is derived to protect workers and members of the public. Slide 17, please. 10 CFR 830 requires DOE to categorize facilities using a consistent approach. Specifically, the 2001 version of 10 CFR 830 states that a contractor must categorize a facility consistent with DOE Standard 1027-92. Because the rule uses the terminology, and I quote, consistent with, DOE allows the use of multiple hazard categorization standards as long as DOE deems that the methodology used in a newer standard is consistent with DOE Standard 1027-1992. In 2018, DOE published an updated draft version of 10 CFR 830. This version proposed two changes to the hazard categorization portion of the rule. Specifically, where the rule cites Standard 1027-1992, DOE proposed inserting the words, quote, or successor document, as you see on the slide in bold font. The revision could allow fundamental changes to the methodology for hazard categorization and successor standards. The draft rule also proposed removing the table of qualitative hazard categorization definitions, which I displayed on the previous slide. These two proposed rule changes served as the basis for two board sub-recommendations, which I will describe on the next slide. Slide 18, please. In recommendation 2020-1, the board had two hazard categorization sub-recommendations. Sub-recommendation 2A recommended that DOE retain the qualitative definitions of hazard categories in 10 CFR 830. Sub-recommendation 2B recommended that DOE revise 10 CFR 830 to mandate use of a single version of standard 1027 when performing facility hazard categorization. DOE proposed changes to 10 CFR 830 are important because the revised language could have allowed DOE to change the hazard category definitions and the hazard categorization methodology without further rulemaking or public comment. Further, allowing the use of multiple versions of the hazard categorization standard could result in an inconsistent and inappropriate gradation of DOE defense nuclear facilities, which could lead to the development of an inadequate control set used to protect workers and members of the public. Slide 19, please. Now I would like to shift focus to the current status of these sub-recommendations. DOE rejected the board's hazard categorization sub-recommendations because DOE was considering the matter in current rulemaking. In the final versions of the rule published earlier this year, DOE removed the qualitative hazard categorization definitions, which was consistent with the draft rule language. DOE did not end up inserting the problematic, quote, or successor document language in the final rule, and retained the original requirement that appeared in the 2001 version of 10 CFR 830 that a contractor must categorize a facility consistent with DOE standard 1027-1992. Further, DOE clarified in a supplementary information published with the rule that any future changes to hazard categorization or substantive changes to DOE standard 1027-1992 would be conducted through the rulemaking process. This change was a significant improvement compared to the draft rule. Slide 20, please. Overall, even though DOE rejected the hazard categorization sub-recommendations, we believe that the changes to the final rule partially address the board's hazard categorization sub-recommendations. Removal of the or successor document and the additional language in the supplementary information would require DOE to enter rulemaking if they were to change the hazard categorization methodology. Similarly, even though the final version of 10 CFR 830 no longer has the qualitative hazard categorization definitions, it still references DOE standard 1027-1992, which has these definitions. Accordingly, we believe that DOE would need to enter rulemaking to change the hazard categorization definitions as well. Based on the changes made to the final rule, we believe DOE partially addressed the sub-recommendation. However, DOE still allows the use of multiple versions of the hazard categorization standard because 10 CFR 830 uses the terminology consistent with. Since the board issued recommendation 2020-1, the board staff performed a review of the three standards DOE allows its contractors to use for hazard categorization. The staff review identified deficiencies, inconsistencies, and non-conservatisms between these three standards. These deficiencies may result in inappropriate hazard categorization, which could lead to the development of an inadequate control set to protect workers and the public. The next slide describes these inconsistencies and non-conservatisms in more detail. Slide 21, please. DOE allows its contractors to use three standards for hazard categorization, which I mentioned before. The first is DOE standard 1027-1992. This standard is referenced in 10 CFR 830 and provides the methodology that future revisions must be consistent with in order to comply with the rule. The second standard is NNSA Supplemental Directive 1027. The staff believes that this standard is the most problematic. The Supplemental Directive changed the Hazard Category 2 and Hazard Category 3 threshold quantity derivation methodologies compared to what was used in DOE Standard 1027-1992. These threshold quantity values are extremely important as they serve as the basis for which hazard category a facility falls into. Now I would like to get into some of the specifics of these changes. When deriving the Hazard Category 2 threshold quantity values, both DOE Standard 1027-92 and DOE Standard 1027-2018 use bounding assumptions regarding the lung absorption type, which is an input parameter used in the hazard categorization tables. The NNSA Supplemental Directive did not use bounding assumptions for the lung absorption type. Instead, the NNSA Supplemental Directive used values that were not technically justified and may not be conservative for the inventories and materials stored at DOE facilities. This change could significantly impact the quantity of material allowed in hazard category 3 facilities. For certain radionuclides, a hazard category 3 facility categorized using the NNSA supplemental directive is allowed to have 2 to 3 times more nuclear material than if the same facility was categorized using DOE standard 1027/2018. The NNSA supplemental directive also non-conservatively changed the quantitative methodology used to derive the table of hazard category 3 threshold quantity values compared to what was used in DOE standard 1027/1992. Specifically, DOE standard 1027/1992 considered a whole body effective dose and an organ-specific dose and applied the more limiting value for each radionuclide. The NNSA supplemental directive only used the whole body dose threshold and neglected the organ-specific dose. This change in methodology non-conservatively affects the categorization of below category 3 facilities. Moving on, the third and newest standard is DOE standard 1027/2018. This standard corrected the hazard category 2 threshold quantity value change made by the NNSA supplemental directive and is now consistent with DOE standard 1027/1992 in that regard. However, DOE standard 1027/2018 suffers from the same hazard category 3 threshold quantity discrepancy as the NNSA supplemental directive, which we believe makes that portion of the standard inconsistent with 10 CFR 830. In addition to these inconsistencies, the board staff believe that all 3 standards could benefit from improved guidance and requirements to ensure appropriate and consistent hazard categorization. Ensuring appropriate facility categorization is important because under-categorizing a facility could result in analysts failing to identify appropriate controls to protect workers and members of the public. Slide 22, please. So to sum up, DOE proposed 2 fundamental changes to the hazard categorization process in a draft version of 10 CFR 830. In response to these changes, the board recommended that DOE retain definitions of hazard categories in 10 CFR 830 and to mandate the use of a single version of standard 1027 for facility hazard categorization. DOE rejected these sub-recommendations, but they partially addressed the issue in the final version of 10 CFR 830. The staff's biggest remaining concern is with the current standards that DOE allows its contractors to use for hazard categorization. Specifically, we've identified significant concerns and deficiencies with DOE standard 1027/2018 and NNSA supplemental directive 1027. We believe that these standards change the hazard categorization methodology compared to what was used in DOE standard 1027/1992, which we believe makes the newer standards inconsistent with 10 CFR 830. This concludes my prepared remarks, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Dunleavy. And at this time, I'd like to ask if my fellow board members have any questions for our presenter. Ms. Roberson?
Mr. Summers, I'm going to defer to Ms. Connery while I think about how I want to frame my question.
Very good.
Okay. Thank you.
Of course. Ms. Connery?
So I have a question, Michael, Mr. Dunleavy. So with the NNSA supplemental directive, clearly we believe that this is inconsistent with 1027/92. Now that the rule is finalized, is there a mechanism by which DOE has to go back and prove that why they think it is consistent that you know of?
So in the forward to the NNSA supplemental directive, the DOE General Counsel weighed in that they thought it was consistent with the 1027/1992 method. So I don't necessarily know if there's a formal mechanism to do that check, but they could just discontinue its use and then do an extensive condition to ensure that facilities using the NNSA supplemental directive are appropriately categorized.
You said the General Counsel made that determination? I mean, was there a technical basis underpinning that?
I'm not sure on the details. We didn't get into that in our discussions with DOE. That's just what the NNSA supplemental directive states in its text.
And so since the rule is finalized at this point in time, do you think that there is a way to address the board's concerns without reopening the rule at this point in time?
I do. I think there's a way to kind of address 90% of the board's concerns and the staff's concerns. And that would be to, update the 3 standards that DOE currently allows to fix the deficiencies that I described today, discontinue their use in the future, and then do an extensive condition review to ensure existing hazard category 3 and below hazard category 3 facilities are appropriately categorized.
Okay, understood. The consistent with piece is a little bit bothersome because it seems very subjective from my point of view. But
it is. I think some of the reason why they did that was because DOE Standard 1027/1992 is based on scientific information on how radionuclides behave in the human body from the 1970s. The newer standards were basically marketed on updating these parameters based on newer scientific data on how these materials behave in the body, since we have a lot more data, models, experiments since then. But I agree, it could lead to different hazard categorizations of different facilities with that consistent way.
And the update in the science does not allow you to then be non-conservative when it comes to, assumptions, bounding assumptions. I mean, I think that's the issue with the NNSA supplemental.
Correct. So not only did they update the scientific parameters, which would likely be okay, they also changed the methodology in addition to updating those scientific parameters.
Okay. I think I might have stalled long enough for Ms. Roberson to formulate her question, so I will cede the floor.
No, I appreciate it. Your questions were great. I actually just had one question to add on top of yours, and that is in that DOE rejected the sub-recommendation, but did take actions in the final rule, which, what we care about is in the end are the right things done to ensure protection of the worker and the public. But what is the staff, even with that, the staff has lingering concerns. What is the staff's view or recommendation at this point that of the options that the board consider relative to this specific sub-recommendation area?
So I think I would advocate revising the recommendation to shift the focus to fixing the deficiencies in the hazard categorization standards themselves, as opposed to fixing 10 CFR 830. I also believe that, as I mentioned before, that DOE would benefit from an extensive condition review to ensure existing facilities are appropriately categorized. So I'd say, shift the focus from the rule itself to these other two mechanisms. And I think that would address 90% of the current concern. But, as Ms. Connery pointed out, it still has the consistent width. So it could still allow multiple versions of the standard. But if you fix the allowable standards, that concern, dampens significantly.
Thank you, sir. I don't have any additional questions, Mr. Summers.
Thank you, Ms. Connery and Ms. Roberson. Appreciate your questions and the answers, Mr. Dunleavy. At this time, we'd like to take a break, and we'd like to return at 12:10. So that's about 7 minutes, 12:10. See everybody in about 7 minutes. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. At this time, I'd like to turn the presentation and the meeting back over to Mr. Rossetti for our two other presenters. Mr. Rossetti, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Summers. We will now move to hear from Jason Anderson to discuss DOE approvals. Mr. Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Rossetti. Good afternoon, board members and my fellow colleagues. My name is Jason Anderson, and I'm a member of the board's technical staff. This afternoon, I will be discussing the elimination of the requirement for the Department of Energy to annually review and approve their contractors' safety bases. Slide 24, please. In the department's 2018 draft rule, they proposed removing the previously necessary requirement for the department to annually review and approve the documented safety analyses submitted by a contractor. Although the board recommended against the removal of this requirement, in its 2020 final rule, the department decided to eliminate it nonetheless. As recently as recommendation 19-1, the board has identified instances where the department is not routinely reviewing safety basis documentation. In some instances, these lapses have lingered for several years. Why is this a problem? Well, in a few moments, Mr. Oberruder will take you through some of the regulatory improvements that the staff has identified that would bolster the documented safety analysis, or DSA, submittal process, and that will make it easier for the department to conduct such a routine analysis. During the current discussion, I will simply talk to why the department has an obligation at some periodicity to review and approve the entirety of the DSA. The department approves an initial DSA for a facility and then relies on the unreviewed safety question determination, or USQD process, to evaluate changes to the safety envelope. Further, the board identified some safety basis documentation that the department is not currently required to review and approve. These include things like justifications for continuing operations, or JCOs, and evaluations of the safety of the situation, or ESSs. The staff concern with not routinely reviewing and approving the entirety of the safety basis is that the USQD process did not account for what I will call envelope drift. That is, that small changes to the safety envelope may eventually allow the safety envelope to drift outside of that initially reviewed and approved by the department. Slide 25, please. So what did the board recommend? Well, as originally envisioned, the annual update process was intended to be a fairly routine review of the cumulative changes to the safety basis that the department's contractors had made during the previous year. However, with the quote, considerable implementation challenges, end quote, that the department has had with conforming to such a requirement, the board suggested that the department conduct a causal analysis to get to the root of why these problems existed in the first place and continue after nearly 20 years of runtime. The department might have identified potential improvement areas like ineffective training of federal staff, incomplete or technically unjustified submission by contractors, and unbounding or non-conservative hazard analyses in documented safety analysis. Slide 26, please. Additionally, the board recommended that during its annual review, the department should take into consideration the cumulative effects of the small changes to the safety basis that occur throughout a given year to verify that the contractor was still operating within the departmentally approved safety framework. The benefit of a periodic, if not annual, review of the safety basis documentation is that it also affords the department an opportunity to identify latent defects in the originally submitted safety analysis. Many of the board's numerous recommendations to the department have identified instances where the safety analysis was non-conservative or incomplete. Additionally, the frequent PISA declarations the department's contractors issue in a given year demonstrate that the contractors for these facilities have not as rigorously defined the safety envelope as is necessary. Although the standard for review and approval of DSAs by field offices suggests that the review consider the cumulative effect of DSA changes by USQDs, field offices should also frequently review the entirety of the safety basis. If the field offices were to review the entirety of the safety analysis on some periodicity, it would afford the department an opportunity to identify these latent defects. In fact, both of the board's recent recommendations, 2019-1 and 2019-2, have dealt with inadequacies in safety basis documentation, one at Pantex and the second at the Savannah River site, further justifying the need for some level of periodic federal review. The board also recommended some additional safety basis documentation that the department should review and approve, such as JCOs and ESSs. Broadly, these documents arise from the declaration of a potential inadequacy in the safety analysis, or PISA. An example might be a fire suppression system that would not extinguish the highest postulated hazard fire. Since these documents are contractor submissions analyzing why they feel they can continue operations despite the deficient condition, the board determined that these documents, which modify the safety envelope, ought to be reviewed and approved commensurate with the DSA. Although many field offices do review and approve these documents, there is currently no requirement for them to do so. By adding such a requirement to the rule, it would eliminate the possibility that such an unapproved document might exist. Finally, the board noted in recommendation 19-1 that there were instances where JCOs were lingering for years, despite the department's own rule that contractors would fully analyze these temporary allowances during the annual DSA update and submit to the department for review. Slide 27, please. So how did the department respond? The department rejected all of the board's sub-recommendations regarding the review and approval of DSAs. First, DOE rejected sub-recommendation 3A because DOE was considering the matter in the current rulemaking. That is the revision to 10 CFR 830, nuclear safety management, that Mr. Rossetti discussed earlier. It is the staff opinion that without analyzing the underlying problems the department was having with reviewing and improving what are intended to be high-quality DSAs with well-justified technical merit, the board's issue remains valid. Second, the department rejected sub-recommendations 3B and 3C because they were outside of the scope of the current rulemaking. The department's response in this area was relatively terse. They stated only that they will perform a regulatory analysis to evaluate whether any changes to 10 CFR Part 830 should be proposed through an additional rulemaking. Due to the muted technical response to these sub-recommendations, it is the staff opinion that these board issues remain valid. Slide 28, please. In summary, the board recommended bolstering rather than weakening the department's authority in managing their defense nuclear facility contractors. Specifically, the board recommended that the department determine why it was difficult for field offices to review and approve annual updates to DSAs by their contractors. The board recommended that the department consider cumulative changes during its annual DSA reviews. And finally, the board recommended additional safety basis documentation that the department should review and approve. The department rejected all of the board's sub-recommendations in this part. One, because it was part of the rulemaking, and two, because they were outside of the scope of the rulemaking. The department removed the requirement for annual review and approval of the contractor submitted DSA in the final rule issuance, and they are instead relying on field office review of USQDs to maintain the safety envelope at defense nuclear facilities. It is the staff opinion that the board's concerns remain unaddressed by the department. That concludes my prepared remarks. Thank you. I am happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Anderson. Really appreciate your presentation. I do have one question on slide 20, or regarding slide number 24, before I turn over to my fellow board members for any of their comments or questions. So on slide 24, you talk about the piecemeal approach versus a comprehensive approach to look and review safety basis. And so in your opinion, and from what technical work and research that you and your team has done to date, what advantages, if any, are there to doing a piecemeal approach to reviewing the safety basis rather than a periodic, holistic, and comprehensive safety basis review? Thank you.
Thank you for your question, sir. So I will say that by only reviewing the USQDs, you can evaluate small incremental changes so there are less burden on the field offices. So they can have fewer safety analysts on staff, and they would be able to periodically, they would be able to routinely review those USQDs with a smaller staff. So that's one advantage. Second, it's also quicker. Time to review a USQD can be, from a couple of hours to a couple of days, whereas to do a comprehensive DSA review can take months. So there's that time advantage as well.
Very good. I really appreciate your response, Mr. Anderson. So at this time, I'd like to turn over the opportunity for Ms. Roberson to ask any comments or questions. Ms. Roberson?
Thank you, Mr. Summers. I guess I have a couple of questions that I wanted to ask, and I don't know if they're questions you can answer, Mr. Anderson, but I appreciate your consideration. So in line with Mr. Summers' question, it's not my sense that an annual review, as long as the DSA is maintained current and integrated, is an overly time-consuming process either. Am I wrong?
No, ma'am. And so I think that you're actually spot on. So as originally envisioned, when 830 was originally rolled out in the early 2000s, that's what the department thought was going to happen. They thought that they would be able to have a baseline DSA that was, slowly changed by USQs that would maintain, the conservative bounding analysis as the original. But we've had 20 or so years of runtime with it, and the department itself acknowledges that there were considerable implementation challenges with that model. And so rather than what we suggested what the board recommended in the recommendation is that they figure out why it was so tough, they just removed the requirement altogether.
Yeah. So we suggested, our primary suggestion in this area was that they do a causal analysis. And a causal analysis doesn't just look at, the cause, it looks at the effect of changes, and they rejected doing that analysis, which is surprising since, this is DOE has its own standard. It does this and it does it very well. My question is, we agree with DOE that problems existed in this area, some of which you stated, whether it's timeliness, appropriate resources applied, and some other examples that you gave as well too. Did they do any analysis? Are we aware that they did any analysis where they determined that this was the effective way to address the issues they were experiencing, and there could be no unacceptable effect or consequence as a result of it?
So we have recently received what they're calling their analysis on why this is the right move. But we've only had it for a couple of days, and so we haven't been able to conduct a complete review. But based on our initial review of the document, it appears that their primary reason for dismissing the annual review requirement is that it is duplicative. So it's not, it is not addressing the board's concerns.
And I think that could be meaningful if we never saw value add coming from those federal reviews. My sense is that we look to DOE, and we very often see that without DOE's review and oversight of those processes, there would be problems missed. Is that your view as well?
Yes, ma'am, absolutely. Yeah, I think that that's true. So some of the recent correspondence that we've had with the department have demonstrated that there have been issues with the safety basis that have lingered for a number of years, specifically with 19-1, where, if there were, say, a strong, robust federal review of a given DSA on a given year, it's very likely that they would have caught some of those deficiencies that we ourselves identified.
Thank you, sir. No more questions right now.
Thank you, Ms. Roberson. Ms. Conner, do you have any comments or questions, ma'am?
I do. I think, look, this rejection is the one overall that frosted my cupcake the most, because I just don't understand what they were doing, because we time and time again at both the staff level, at the field office level, and at the headquarters level, we've heard how frustrated they were with this process and with the product that they were getting from the contractor not just at NNA sites, at DOE EM sites as well. And so it's like they just gave up and said, yeah, we're just going to get rid of the whole thing because we can't figure out what to do with it. And they didn't even want to do the causal analysis. So that's that is my personal viewpoint, in case you didn't know what it was. But my question for you, sir, is this. So how does the action to remove the federal yearly DSA approval fit in with the department's idea of a graded approach? Because wouldn't, for instance, federal review on some periodicity at higher risk sites or sites that have historically been troubled by their DSAs be more in line with this risk-based approach?
Thank you for the question. Yes, absolutely. So I think that, the absolute wholesale removal of the requirement is not in line with the risk-based approach. If I were the department for a day, I think if I were looking at a risk-based approach, the way I would probably do it was maintain annual review of high-risk facilities, such as Category 2 facilities or facilities that have had DSA submission issues. And then perhaps move to, say, a biennial or triennial review of the lower hazard category facilities, say hazard category 3 or below. And that would be more in line with a departmental risk-based approach.
And I don't want to gloss over the JCO and ESS piece of it. And so I just want to know if you can talk to us about any cases in which the staff has identified in which a JCO or an ESS has remained open, i.e. not incorporated into the DSA for an extended period of time, therefore revealing vulnerabilities.
Yes, ma'am. So in recommendation 19-1, there were JCOs that had lingered for several years, mostly because they required construction in order to correct the deficiency. In that case, however, the department did approve those JCOs, so they were not unapproved. But in the recommendation here, what we suggested is that they bolster the requirements for JCOs and ESSs to be approved by the department, so that the potentiality for an unapproved JCO to exist to be eliminated.
Thanks, I appreciate it. No more questions, Mr. Summers.
Thank you very much, Ms. Connery and Mr. Anderson. Mr. Rossetti, oh, I'm sorry, Ms. Roberson, go ahead, please.
I'm sorry, Mr. Summers. We got to, in this newfound way of having public meetings, got to figure out how to get each other's attention. I just had one point, and maybe it's a question for you, Mr. Anderson, and making sure that people understand it isn't just putting a federal signature on a document. I mean, these documents are the form in which the federal government signals that it understands the risk of its operations and it accepts those risks in connection with its responsibility to ensure adequate protection of the workers and the public. And if you want to comment on that, that's great. But I just want to make sure people watching don't think this is just an esoteric discussion. It has meaning when it relates to accountability for ensuring adequate protection.
Yes, ma'am. I would like to comment. So I'll make two comments. First, this is a new change. So we, the staff, do not have any data or any evidence of where this is going to take us. So that's something that we're certainly going to be mindful of and looking out for in the coming months and years. And secondly, I'll say that while reliance on the USQD process seems reasonable, the downside to doing that is there's no formal requirements for how to have an appropriate USQD process. So the department's directive on USQs is a guide, which is an optional, sort of an optional regulatory standard. So across the complex, different contractors implement USQDs differently. So different field offices will review those USQDs inherently differently. So as the risk acceptor, in my opinion, the Secretary of Energy would benefit from, one, formalizing the requirements for USQD, and then formalizing the requirements for the review of those USQDs by the field offices. Now yield back.
Thank you, sir. No further questions, Mr. Summers.
Thank you very much, Ms. Roberson. Ms. Connery, has it sparked any additional questions from you, ma'am?
No, I'm good. No need to reclaim my time. Thanks.
Okay, you're welcome. Thank you a lot, Mr. Anderson. Now, Mr. Rossetti, over to you for our fourth and final presenter today. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Summers. We will move on to Mr. Oberruder, Robert Oberruder, who will discuss safety basis process and requirements. Mr. Oberruder.
Thank you, Mr. Rossetti. Good afternoon, Chairman Summers and board members, Roberson and Connery. My name is Robert Oberruder, and I'm a member of the board's technical staff. I will be discussing the safety basis process and requirements portion of recommendation 2020-1. Slide 30, please. At the beginning of the public meeting, Mr. Rossetti described the importance of 10 CFR 830 to DOE's nuclear safety regulatory framework. In particular, the rule provides requirements for the preparation of nuclear facility safety bases. DOE provides additional requirements in orders and standards. However, there are certain important safety basis components and processes that have little in the way of foundational requirements in the DOE directive system. DOE's recent revision to 10 CFR 830 did not add requirements for these important safety basis components and processes to the rule. And likewise, it did not add to the rule other fundamental concepts and processes that DOE has developed since the rule's revision in 2001, though DOE has found them to be important aspects of nuclear facility safety bases. Also, as discussed previously, both the board and DOE have noted concerns with the documented safety analysis development, review, and approval processes. The concerns were both with the ability of DOE and its contractors to successfully maintain the annual submittal and approval cycle, as well as with the quality of those submittals by contractors to DOE. Slide 31, please. Recommendation 2020-1 contains several sub-recommendations in this topic area, and the first two are shown on this slide. These two sub-recommendations relate, as I've just mentioned, to the annual DSA approval topic that Mr. Anderson discussed in the prior presentation. One sub-recommendation asks DOE to conduct a causal analysis to identify underlying issues that were preventing contractors from developing and submitting high-quality DSAs that DOE could approve on the annual schedule. So while the sub-recommendation that Mr. Anderson previously discussed was for a causal analysis of issues on the DOE side, this sub-recommendation was to look at issues around the contractor's preparation and submittal of DSAs. The next sub-recommendation in this area was for DOE to maintain the annual approval requirement while it executed the two causal analyses that the board recommended. So in summary, the board recommended that DOE figure out what underlying issues were causing difficulties in satisfying the annual approval requirement with quality DSAs before deciding to simply eliminate the requirement. The idea being that without knowing exactly what they're trying to fix, it's not clear whether the proposed solution would fix it. Slide 32, please. The second set of sub-recommendations in the safety basis process and requirements area related to the establishment of implementation requirements for technical safety requirements, or TSRs, and unreviewed safety questions, or USQs, in the DOE regulatory framework, as well as to the creation of requirements for specific administrative controls and the concept of defense in depth in 10 CFR 830. For the benefit of the public, I'm going to try to give a quick description of these terms. So TSRs, or technical safety requirements, establish limits, controls, and related actions necessary for the safe operation of a nuclear facility, as discussed in 10 CFR 830. The unreviewed safety question, or USQ process, is also discussed in 10 CFR 830, and the USQ process is implemented when there is a temporary or permanent change to a facility or its procedures, or a new test or experiment is added to the facility's operations, or in cases where the contractor becomes aware that the facility safety analysis may be inadequate. 10 CFR 830 does contain high-level requirements for TSRs and for USQs. However, the DOE directive system then relies on implementation guidance provided by DOE guides. Specific administrative controls, or SACs, are administrative controls that perform safety functions that have performed by an engineered control. So in other words, if the function was performed by a structure or a system or a component, those components would require designation as either safety significant or safety class controls. DOE first issued Standard 1186 in the year 2004 to provide guidance on specific administrative controls. And SACs have become an important part of the approach to safety at many defense nuclear facilities, though they still remain unaddressed in 10 CFR 830. And finally, the defense in depth concept is a fundamental concept that simply put means that facilities have layers of defense against the release of radioactive or other hazardous materials, so that no one layer by itself, no matter how effective, is completely relied upon. This concept is included in various DOE orders and standards for nuclear facility design and safety basis preparation. In fact, I just borrowed that definition from DOE Standard 3009. However, it has not yet been firmly rooted in 10 CFR 830, which is DOE's top tier document for nuclear safety. So all these taken together, these three sub-recommendations were intended to improve DOE's regulatory framework in ways that would promote more consistent implementation of nuclear safety processes across the complex through the establishment of additional requirements. And consistency in this regard is important because it improves DOE's ability to hold contractors accountable to accepted levels of performance, and thus to ensure that adequate protection of the public is maintained across the complex. Slide 33, please. DOE rejected the causal analysis sub-recommendations for the reason that the annual update approval requirement was subject of the rulemaking at the time. DOE also reiterated that the intent of removing the approval of the annual update was to avoid duplicative effort, given that they already approve individual changes via the USQ process. The response thus does not actually address why DOE and the board consistently find issues with the contractor of the quality of contractor DSA submittals. Therefore, the board's concerns with the DOE contractor's ability to consistently submit quality DSAs remains as it was when the recommendation was issued. DOE stated that it partially accepted the sub-recommendations related to developing requirements for TSRs and the USQ process. However, their response did not actually address the technical aspects of the board's concerns. Rather, DOE indicated that it would do its own evaluation to determine if changes were necessary, and that they would also be awaiting further communication from the board on these topics to inform its path forward. And on a later slide, I will discuss the additional board correspondence on these topics. Slide 34, please. And finally, DOE also rejected the board sub-recommendation related to establishing requirements in 10 CFR 830 for specific administrative controls and for defense in depth. In this case, DOE's basis for rejection was that the topics were outside of the scope of the current rulemaking. Again, DOE noted it would consider further changes to 10 CFR 830 through a future regulatory analysis. The technical basis for including these fundamental concepts and lessons learned in the rule therefore remains the same as when the board made its recommendation. Slide 35, please. So as I noted, since issuing the recommendation, the board has issued a couple of other communications to DOE with relevance to the issues discussed in this set of sub-recommendations. The first was a letter transmitting a staff report that discussed the implementation of the potential inadequacy of the safety analysis process across the DOE complex. The so-called PISA process is used when the contractor operating a DOE nuclear facility becomes aware that the facility's safety analysis may not be bounding or may be otherwise inadequate. In those situations, the contractor is required by 10 CFR 830 to place the facility in a safe configuration, to notify DOE, to perform an unreviewed safety question determination, and then to submit an evaluation of the safety of the situation to DOE prior to removing any operational restrictions. However, besides those top-level requirements, DOE contractors must then rely on the DOE USQ guide for further implementation guidance related to the PISA process. A board staff review looked at the PISA process at sites across the DOE complex and found inconsistent implementation. The staff team in particular found that specific requirements and clearer guidance, notably with respect to timeliness considerations for executing the PISA process and for the treatment of new information as part of the PISA process, would improve implementation and help reduce unknown risk. The second piece of relevant correspondence from the board was a letter forwarding DNFSB Tech Report 45, violations on the nuclear safety basis. This report provided significant details regarding a staff review of how sites across the DOE complex handle violations of TSRs, and more generally, how they handle operations outside of the boundaries of the DOE-approved safety basis. Of note for this setting, the staff team found differing interpretations of the guidance provided in the DOE guide on TSRs, and that the lack of requirements in this space limited DOE's ability to challenge the content and structure of TSRs proposed by the contractor. Clear requirements, therefore, would improve DOE's ability to hold contractor personnel to an appropriate standard for TSR development. Next slide, please. Slide 36. In summary, then, sub-recommendations made by the board in the area of safety basis process and requirements focused on improvements to DOE's regulatory framework for nuclear safety basis development. DOE rejected the sub-recommendations on the grounds related to the 10 CFR 830 rulemaking, or else they partially accepted the sub-recommendations without addressing the technical aspects of the board's concerns or making clear that their suggested actions would successfully address the board's issues. Overall, the staff's assessment is that the board's concerns therefore remain valid, and DOE should buttress its regulatory framework with implementation requirements to ensure greater consistency across the complex. This would improve DOE's ability to hold contractors accountable to expected levels of performance, and thus ensure that adequate protection of the public is maintained across the complex. DOE should also perform an analysis to determine why contractors struggle to submit quality DSAs on the annual cycle in order to determine whether other actions are warranted in that area as well. Subject to your further questions, that's the end of my briefing, and I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Oberruder. At this time, I'd like to offer the opportunity for my fellow board members to ask any questions or provide any comments. I'll ask Ms. Roberson first. Ms. Roberson, do you have any comments or questions, ma'am?
Just a couple, Mr. Summers. Thank you very much. And before we deliberate, I know I'm saying a lot of things. I'm just trying to make sure I have clear in my mind. So DOE took an initiative to revise 830, which we agreed it was time to do so, and they had the opportunity to make improvements in an area which they and we agree require improvements. That's in the quality and the timeliness and the effectiveness of the safety basis documentation that provides the foundation for ensuring protection of the public. So, and I guess what I'm missing here is, what did they actually change to improve the quality of the DSAs? I know they deducted some things. Did they add anything in that area?
So to my knowledge, they did not add significant new elements to 10 CFR 830 that were intended to improve the quality of contractor submittals. As Mr. Anderson previously discussed, the reliance on the USQ process by the DOE for their, kind of maintaining awareness of the safety envelope that's sort of an unrelated change to the root of the question about contractor submittal quality. I'm not sure that they attempted to improve that directly by the changes to the rulemaking.
And so my last comment at this point is same question I had before. Our primary recommendation, although we had multiple layers, but our primary recommendation was we agree that improvements need to be made. We recommended that they actually conduct an analysis to make sure that any changes they made, they could understand the cause and effect of those changes. Are we aware that they performed any analysis focused on improving the quality of DSAs across the complex?
So another good question. To my knowledge, the analysis that they performed looked at improvements to the efficiency of the annual approval cycle. So the annual submittal and approval cycle, I should say. So I don't know that they had, particular focus on quality improvements, unless the view that by improving the submittal efficiency, efficiencies gained would be replowed into quality improvements. But I would, that's purely speculative on my part. I don't know that was a direct aim of the revision.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Roberson. Ms. Connery, do you have any comments or questions, ma'am?
Yeah, so when the department looked at this piece of the recommendation, like their sole basis for not accepting it was that they were in rulemaking and this was out of scope of that rulemaking, or it was within scope of that rulemaking. And so they didn't provide us with any specificity as to why they weren't going to address these issues, correct?
So that's definitely accurate for 3 of the 5 sub-recommendations where they were rejected on the grounds of the rulemaking. The 2 that they indicated they partially accepted were essentially partially accepted with the idea that they would take an independent look to determine whether or not they found issues that were worthy of modification to their directives.
Right. So I recall that there was a lot of interest on the part of DOE to see what our proof was or what our technical basis was for these issues. And I think that the recommendation team did a great job of identifying them, but then we provided further information. And so I'm going to I'm going to give a plug for our staff reports, the July 2020 staff report on the complex-wide implementation of potential inadequacy of the safety analysis process, and then the very thorough technical report on violations of nuclear safety bases. And I think those had pretty significant amounts of technical detail. Do you know how the department responded to that? And do you think that that would impact how they looked at these recommendations now? I know it's speculative, but.
Sure. So as I said, in the department's response to the board's recommendation, they knew that those reports were coming. So they said, in essence, we're looking forward to getting them and seeing what they have to say so that we can, respond after we see what they look like, I guess you could say. That said, I'm not fully privy to, what has transpired at the department since, the receipt of those documents. I believe that there has been some, discussions and sort of, not to abuse the word piecemeal, but, by, specific field offices or specific contractors, either reaching out for discussion at a staff-to-staff level, or, up through the departmental representative across to the technical director, to feedback some things. But I don't know that there's been a rigorous sort of approach upon receipt of those documents.
So just a comment. So I think a challenge we often have is both on our side and the department side is when we provide examples, the inclination is to always go and fix the example, right? So show me where there are problems, and you show them where there are problems in a specific place, and they go, aha, and let's fix that problem. And I think that I would just submit that part of the beauty, I believe, of this recommendation is it went to the root causes of these problems and said, here's why you're having not great effect at these particular places. Things happen in places, yes, but there's an underlying cause to it, and here's the thread that shows you how they're interconnected. So I hope that the department, should we reissue this recommendation in its current form or in an altered form, would take that holistic approach rather than trying to play whack-a-mole at each specific issue that we've addressed. Thank you, Mr. Summers. No more comments.
Thank you very much, Ms. Connery, and thank you very much, Mr. Oberruder, for the presentation. At this time, let's take a break until 12:55, again 12:55, and we will return and conduct some deliberations amongst the board members. Thank you all the presenters for all the presentations that were provided. Thank you. We're on break until 12:55. Welcome back, everyone. At this time, before we begin the deliberations between the board members, I will turn over the floor to Mr. Rossetti, who will provide a summary of the sub-recommendations and the presentations that have been provided. Thank you, Mr. Rossetti. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Summers. Before I continue, I would like to provide a better answer to one of Ms. Connery's initial questions, specifically the one regarding how the department characterized the board's comments on 10 CFR 830. The Federal Register notice that published the final rules stated that DOE received public comments from multiple individuals and one entity. So in answer to your question, I think that the DNFSB would be the entity. Now I will speak to slide 37. In summary, recommendation 2020-1 is intended to strengthen the department's regulatory framework, including the department's orders and standards. The recommendation also seeks to maintain and improve federal accountability mechanisms and fundamental nuclear safety processes. Finally, the department needs to maintain a robust safety posture and strong regulatory framework to ensure that both its aging facilities and infrastructure and its new facilities provide adequate protection of public health and safety. Slide 38, please. As such, Recommendation 2020-1 focused on 4 areas. The first is aging infrastructure. While the department's response stated that it accepted this sub-recommendation, the department did not commit to a specific action to address the board's concerns. Therefore, in my opinion, the board's concerns remain. Namely, that the department needs to develop and implement an approach to aging management that includes a formal process for identifying and performing infrastructure upgrades that are necessary to ensure facilities and structure systems and components can perform their safety functions. The second area is hazard categories. Although the department rejected these sub-recommendations, the department did make changes in the final rule that partially addressed the board's concerns. However, in my opinion, hazard categorization implementation concerns still exist. These concerns regarding hazard categorization are due to deficiencies, inconsistencies, and non-conservatisms in the multiple standards used by the department. Slide 39, please. The third area the recommendation focused on is DOE approvals. The department rejected these sub-recommendations. I asked the department essentially for its analysis regarding implementation issues with the annual approval process. The response from the department was that the federal approval of the safety basis is duplicative with the federal approval of positive USQs. However, this ignores the gap of requirements for federal approval of justification for continued operations and evaluations of the safety of the situation. In both of these cases, although often approved by the department, the rule does not require federal approval of these 2 types of changes to the safety basis. Without the required annual approval of the safety basis, the department is potentially allowing the contractors to make changes to the safety basis without having to approve those changes. The board articulated this in the recommendation, and the department has not addressed these important concerns. Therefore, the board's concerns remain. In addition, the department's federal staff must review and approve the safety bases for defense nuclear facilities on some periodicity to evaluate for cumulative impacts or latent defects. Slide 40, please. The fourth and final area is safety basis process and requirements. Again, I asked the department essentially for its analysis regarding implementation issues with the annual update process. The department did not provide an analysis as to what implementation issues hindered contractors from efficiently and effectively performing the annual update. The department rejected these sub-recommendations. In my opinion, the board's concerns remain. The department's nuclear safety regulatory framework meets clear requirements to ensure consistent and adequate implementation across the complex. In addition, an analysis and understanding of the complications and issues with both the contractor's annual submittal and federal approval is warranted. Slide 41, please. Recommendation 2020-1 was unique in that its subject involves 10 CFR 830. However, the concepts and concerns expressed therein are independent of the department's rulemaking on 10 CFR 830. Given the department's revised 10 CFR 830 of 2020 and the information the staff has presented to the board today, it is my opinion that the concerns expressed in the board's recommendation 2020-1 are still valid and still need to be addressed by the department. As such, I think the board's concerns warrant continued discussion by the board. I turn it back over to you, Mr. Summers, and your fellow board members to continue the discussion and deliberation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rossetti, and to the rest of the presenters. Really appreciate the presentations and the information that you provided to the board. At this time, the board will deliberate in 3 primary areas. The first area is the sub-recommendations that were just provided. The second area is the recommendation 2020-1 as a whole. And then finally, although not discussed up to this point, deliberations will focus on the draft recommendation process as part of the board's recommendation process to the Department of Energy. So, topic 1, sub-recommendations that were presented.
Mr. Summers?
Yes.
I apologize for the interruption. I just wanted to ask Mr. Rossetti one last question before we go into the deliberation portion.
Of course.
So, sorry for the late question. I didn't want to ask the staff. I thought it would be better to ask you about this because it's a broader question. And that has to do with the inconsistencies of TSRs across the complex and any challenges that presented with the response to COVID and what you've seen.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. So as we've mentioned a couple times today in the staff's testimony, the board did provide the department Tech 45, which was the technical report on violations of the nuclear safety basis, which was broad topic was technical safety requirements. In that technical report, there were a lot of specific examples, as you pointed out, of specific cases where there have been inconsistencies across the complex regarding implementation of TSRs, timelines for reporting TSRs and correcting deficiencies in those. And COVID presents a unique situation, as evidenced by us being here in the virtual platform holding the public meeting. We've seen across the country where the localities where the department has defense nuclear facilities, there have been upticks in cases, and some TSRs rely on minimum staffing levels. So in answer to your question, given the lack of consistent implementation, lack of specific requirements for technical safety requirements, complicate that with the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, and the situation that the country's dealing with, I don't have specific hard case of something the staff has noticed, but it's a risk that I think that the department should understand, and I think in some respects is working to understand, but providing that information to the secretary so that he can make informed decisions would be beneficial to the department.
Thank you. I appreciate the answer.
Thank you, Ms. Connery, and thank you, Ms. Rossetti, for your answer. Now at this time for deliberations, the first topic is about sub-recommendations. So there were 4 primary areas within the sub-recommendations: aging infrastructure, hazard categories, DOE approvals, and the safety basis process and requirements. So under aging infrastructure, in addition to the questions and comments already provided throughout the presentation and up to this point, do my fellow board members, Ms. Connery and Roberson, do you have any additional comments or questions you'd like to make about the first subtopic of aging infrastructure at this time?
Mr. Summers, I don't know if it's a comment or question or something that my fellow board members want to react to, but I continue to stand by the board's recommendation to the department to really focus on ensuring it has requirements and consistent requirements in the area of aging infrastructure. The important missions in the department long-term are not going to go away. And for the foreseeable future, they're going to continue to rely on aging infrastructure. And we talked about a number of concepts in this recommendation and in this public meeting that become even more prominent as these facilities age. I'm specifically concerned about the formality around specific administrative controls, basically exchanging engineered controls for procedural controls, which we have seen, and this is why the board made the recommendation to focus more on that concept and formalize it more in the department, because we know as facilities age, it becomes more important in ensuring that there are adequate controls in place to protect the public and the worker. So from an aging infrastructure perspective, I don't think the department provided any comfort in their response to the board's recommendation in this area.
Thank you very much, Ms. Roberson. Ms. Connery, do you have any comments either regarding what Ms. Roberson said or any additional comments or questions, ma'am?
So I just want to respond to something that Ms. Roberson said about the reliance, the movement of reliance from engineered controls to procedural controls, because I think that the other phenomenon that's happening in addition to infrastructure aging is kind of an aging out of the older workforce that is very comfortable with these facilities, and new workforce coming on. And I don't remember the numbers, but I remember Administrator Gordon Hagerty was in the process of hiring a significant number of workers for some of the NNSA facilities. So that's new individuals in old facilities that don't have engineered controls necessarily, relying on administrative controls, and therefore they're going to have to get their knowledge from someplace. So they're going to have to be trained, and as the workforce ages and ages out, there's fewer and fewer people to provide that training. So I think that it does, having a comprehensive approach makes much more sense. And I know we've kind of probed the department on this a few times, and it so far hasn't stuck. So I support the comments that Ms. Roberson made, and I do feel that this is an area that we need to continue to press the department on.
Thank you, Ms. Connery. And from my perspective, I agree that the aging infrastructure is certainly a concern. It's been recognized by administrations for years. The past two Department of Energy leaders have certainly, and senior leadership have certainly put emphasis on the fact that aging infrastructure is a concern. And the fact that they require more surveillance, more maintenance, et cetera, and that many of the structures, or at least a pretty significant portion of the structures, are over 50 years old, and some dating back to the original Manhattan days projects, at least in the NNSA area, and probably similarly in E&M or EM. So I concur and also agree that the aging infrastructure is an area that requires continued attention, and we will continue, I think, to monitor closely and analyze and advise the Secretary of Energy on what we think and what we see. I'd like to move on to the next topic, next sub-recommendation topic of hazard categories. Under hazard categories, Ms. Roberson, do you have any additional comments or questions you'd like to make, ma'am?
I think at this point, I know we have some additional information coming from the staff, and I'd like to look at that in concert with the recommendation and the department's response to get my head around where I think we are on that one. It's probably the best way to say it.
Very good, ma'am. Thank you. Ms. Connery, do you have any comments or additional questions about the hazard categories?
So I think on the hazard categories, I think the issues that I have SEM to 1027, and specifically the consistency of the NNSA addendum to that order. So from my perspective, I think looking at the words on the page on the recommendation, I think we could probably, if the board members are supportive of it, I think the way Mr. Dunleavy characterized the potential changes to that would be helpful.
Very good. Thank you, Ms. Connery. I don't have any additional comments this time about the hazard categories, so we'll move on to the next topic, next sub-recommendation topic, and that is DOE approvals. Ms. Roberson, do you have any comments or additional questions to what we've already provided about DOE approvals at this time?
I don't have any additional questions, Mr. Summers, but I would comment that I see the last two sub-recommendations in the same light. We know what we see in the complex, and we know the department sees the same issues. And I am frustrated that as a learning organization, there's a resistance to really looking at the processes and identifying how to improve them overall, rather than just eliminate something out of hand. It's not just reducing the cycle time, but it's improving the process so that the federal government's commitment to the workers and the public can be seen and justified through technical analysis that can be supported and is of a high quality. So I'm very frustrated that we couldn't convince the department to take a wholesale look at baseline foundational processes to how they assure safety, to identify what really are the improvements that can be made to ensure that the changes that you are making don't weaken it versus strengthen it.
Thank you very much, Ms. Roberson. Ms. Connery, do you have any additional comments or questions concerning the DOE approvals, ma'am?
So I think I made my feelings clear about this one. I think that look, we're past the rulemaking now, right? So there is no issue about, are we in rulemaking or are we out of rulemaking? So now the question is, are they going to open up the rule again like they claimed they were going to do and do this in 3 parts, and do we have another shot at it? Or is there something else that we should be doing in some consultation we should be having with the department in order to get at the point of the recommendation, since they didn't take the recommendation with regards to the rulemaking? In other words, how can we ensure, like Ms. Roberson said, how can we ensure the safety aspect is not lost? And from my point of view, the oversight aspect of it. I mean, a lot of this has to do with, the contractors are going to absolutely be concerned about safety. I have no delusions that they're not going to be concerned about safety. However, contractors change over. And so if a contractor works on a DSA that then doesn't get approved at the federal level, and there is a shift in the contractor, then there's a whole new group that comes in with a different culture and a different way of doing business, and they have to untangle the DSA that they were presented with. And there are a few examples of that I'm not going to go into at this point in time, but across the complex where the new contractor was handed a mess of a DSA that then they had to go and reconcile. And the department took themselves a little bit out of that process, and they're continuing to do so. And I just don't think that is appropriate stewardship of the safety of the complex, but there are other ways that we can address this. So I'd love to see us be creative in reframing how this can be addressed. I think the idea of defense in depth, risk-based approach and determining which DSAs would require federal review would be one way to approach it, and consistent with how DOE does business in other areas. But I don't think we should give up the ghost on this one, because I do think it is vitally important to the safety of the complex.
Thank you, Ms. Connery. And as you said, and I think as Ms. Roberson has said in the past, that a certain periodicity maybe could be relooked at that would serve the complex better in order to make sure that it was safety value added and not just another task that required a lot of resources in order to accomplish, keeping in mind that safety is at the core of why to do these in the first place. I'll move on to the 4th and final sub-recommendation that we talked about today, and that is the safety basis process and the requirements. And I will ask Ms. Roberson. Ms. Roberson, do you have any comments or questions, ma'am, concerning the safety basis process and the requirements that were presented, ma'am?
Thank you, Mr. Summers. Again, I don't have any questions, and I would say ditto to what we just said. I think it applies both to the federal role and to improving the quality. And when I say improving the quality, that means improving the quality and the timeliness and the effectiveness throughout the entire safety basis process, the documentation to approval. And so I think for me, it's still very much on the table, because I do not think the department's response to the board's concerns, independent of whether they open or close the rule, have been addressed. Our concerns are valid in or out. It doesn't matter. So I think those are still very much on the table.
Very good. Thank you very much, ma'am. Ms. Connery, do you have any comments or questions concerning the safety basis process and requirements, ma'am?
Now, I think this is part and parcel of the previous recommendation. I mean, we subdivided it. It could have probably been in one, but I do believe that these are all connected and should be addressed similarly.
Thank you very much for your comment. I have no further comments about the safety basis process and requirements, so we'll move on to the second major topic, and that is the recommendation of 2020-1 as a whole. So I'll first start with Ms. Roberson. Ms. Roberson, after we've had some great presentations and technical analysis on the sub-recommendations that were provided earlier, do you have any comments or questions about the recommendation 2020-1 as a whole, ma'am? Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Summers. Listen, I think, as Ms. Connery said, the recommendation stands whether the rule is opened or not. And so I think we need to work with the staff based on any additional work they've done to decide how we want to proceed. But I think the concerns in the recommendation were valid and remain valid in regards to ensuring we don't weaken the safety posture at sites across the complex. And so I'm still a proponent, although there may need to be some updates and changes, but I think we should see what additional information the staff has to evaluate what action we want to take with the recommendation.
Very good, ma'am. Thank you. Thanks for sharing your perspective. Ms. Connery, do you have any comments or questions, ma'am, about the recommendation 2020-1 as a whole, ma'am?
So I was enamored of this recommendation when we first sent it over. I'm probably more enamored of it now because having seen what they did with the rulemaking, and from my opinion, I don't think they did, as Ms. Roberson said, strengthen safety overall, which was the great hope when they reopened the rule. And it sounds like they're not enthusiastic about reopening it again. I do think it's now more than ever imperative that we potentially repackage, but that we reissue this recommendation in some form to the department, because the issues haven't gone away, as the staff has stated. In fact, I think they've been exacerbated by the final rule that was promulgated by the department, unfortunately. And I think that we have to be able to address the ongoing concerns and now the new concerns that have come up now that they've gone and finalized the rule.
Thank you very much, Ms. Connery. And from my perspective, I am very appreciative of all the hard work that the technical staff has put together and done significant analysis and taking a balanced view of not only DOE's perspective, in my opinion, as well as the staff's view and perspective, with keeping in mind the safety at the core is what we are concerned about and what we're talking about, in order to provide additional information for us as board members to consider and whether or not we should revise or repackage the recommendation in some form and send it forward for the Secretary of Energy's consideration based upon our recommendation. I have a lot to think about, and you've given me a lot to think about. I get educated every day, and am thankful that there are so many smart people within the agency and within the nuclear enterprise, DOE included, of course, that help us to be even stronger as we go forward. And this recommendation, potentially, at least at the core, is to strengthen the safety that we have within the complex in order to make sure that the adequate safety and protection of our defense nuclear facilities is kept at the forefront of our mind. For we all know that safe, secure, and effective safety is first. I'd like now to turn to the final topic that we would like to deliberate about today, and that specifically is about the draft in the recommendation process and how the drafts and draft recommendation is part of that recommendation process. I will first turn over to Ms. Roberson. If Ms. Roberson would want to provide any comments or questions or observations about how the draft recommendation process has worked or hasn't worked as part of the overall recommendation process to the Secretary of Energy. Ms. Roberson?
Thank you, Mr. Summers. Well, yeah, I'll kick this off. Fortunately, I was at the board before this process. This has been in place for about 5 years, 5 or 6 years. And I think it's a good time for us to step back and look at how it has improved the recommendation process or not, and maybe even provide that insight in our annual report. As originally envisioned when Congress modified the statute, it was really intended to ensure that there was an awareness to the Secretary of board concerns before the board formally issued a recommendation. It was not intended to be a don't issue a recommendation or not. It was an opportunity for the department to provide factual feedback or any additional information that they wanted the board to consider before actually making a decision about the formality of the recommendation at the end of the process. We've had experiences across the gambit, but I actually think we've probably had less interaction with the department in the recommendation process since that change was instituted than we did before. And this recommendation specifically, we got no technical analysis or feedback. And so I'm just not sure this process is advancing the interactions in a positive way to improve safety at this point. It doesn't say it couldn't, but I don't think it is. So I'm not sure that the draft process benefited us on this recommendation. And quite frankly, it's been tough for everyone that we've issued in the last 5 years.
Thank you very much, Ms. Roberson. Ms. Connery, your perspective on the draft recommendation, how it's either improved or maybe not improved the recommendation process?
Thank you, Mr. Summers. So I think a couple of things. When this legislation came into effect, I think there were parts of the legislation that forced us to put more of a technical justification in our recommendations. From that aspect, I think it strengthened the recommendations that we've sent forward. If you look back at some of our early recommendations, they are skimpy in terms of their length and their heft and the technical underpinnings that we presented to the department. Nowadays, you really can't say that about our recommendations. They are pretty chock full of detail and information and justifications as well. So from that aspect, I think that move in the legislation was good. The draft process, I think, has not benefited us. I'll echo Ms. Robertson's comments on that. I think part of it, what happens is their draft recommendation immediately puts the department in a defensive mode, and they kind of crawl into their hole and they dig through it to see how they can rebut it in a way that will either prevent us from moving forward with this or inform us in a way that would prevent us from moving forward with it, or set up their arguments so that when we issue the final recommendation, they can reject it. What is unclear to me is whether or not that is because of the recommendation process with the draft process in it, or if that is a symptom of just the deterioration of the relationship between the department and the board over time. I think there has been less interaction at the political level, unfortunately, over the past 5 years, at least in my tenure at the board. And there's been more of a defensive posture on the part of the department. Part of the issue with the past couple of recommendations is we were in locked battle with the department over their Order 140.1, which obviously has an impact on how they look at recommendations coming from us and whether or not they were going to accept them or not. Then there was the rulemaking is a special case. And I don't think that they were necessarily on firm legal ground to say that we can't talk to you in the draft process about our rulemaking. I think that is, I will not try to armchair lawyer it, but I don't think that that was an appropriate response, and I don't think it gave the board its due day with the department to talk about the fundamental safety rule that underpins safety within the complex. The very first thing that our statute asks us to do is to ensure that the standards are in place and that they're implemented across the board. So personally, I think that there's several challenges. One is obviously with the draft process, and we're in discussions with the department about an MOU right now. I don't know that you can resolve that with an MOU process, because you'd have to. It's about agreeing that they're going to receive the draft in a particular way. With regards to whether or not it's a heads up to the secretary that we're looking at something, if the secretary doesn't know what we're concerned about, that's an internal DOE breakdown in communication, because it's not as if these are pop-up recommendations that come out of nowhere. Most of them are after weeks and weeks of staff interactions, of letters from the board, in some cases hearings. We don't have a formal escalation where you have to have a hearing before a recommendation, but sometimes we do. And I think what's most disappointing to me is the recommendation piece represents an issue that the board finds the most serious. So when that gets rejected, that's significant. Whereas when we have hearings, we actually tend to, in the past 5 years, we've had some successful hearings where in public, the department has had to, listen to what we had to say and had to respond to it. I'm thinking specifically of the improperly remediated salt waste drums at Lano that led to the WIP situation. So the fact that the board no longer can issue a recommendation and have the department take it on faith that it's well-founded and that the board stands behind it and it's got technical basis, that's a bigger problem than just the draft process. So I went on a little long there, but I think these are issues that we have to actually discuss, and I think discussing them in public is helpful.
Thank you, Ms. Connery. And I don't think that was a long description. I think that was very well articulated. From my perspective, being the newest board member and not having gone from beginning to end throughout the recommendation process, my view so far in the time I've been on the board is that the draft process as part of the recommendation process was meant to facilitate communications and discussion before there was a formal recommendation made to the Secretary of Energy. It appears to have worked pretty well 5 years ago and maybe has deteriorated in value over time. It appears that the draft process could still work if the intended communications, discussion, and trust in communications and coordination about the technical merits of safety concerns is what is at the forefront of what is discussed. We're all working together to make sure that the enterprise is as safe as we possibly can adequately to ensure that the facilities and that the people in the environment are protected. That is at the core. So I think that this discussion about whether or not the draft recommendation process is value added or not value added to the statutory recommendation process that the board executes and implements well is due or requires further discussion, and we certainly will, and would welcome the Department of Energy's discussion and communication on their perspectives about how well or how well not the draft process is working within the statutory recommendation process. At this time, I'd like to turn to my fellow board members for their closing remarks, and then I will end with my remarks. I'll first turn to Ms. Roberson. Ms. Roberson, do you have any closing remarks?
I do. I'll be brief, Mr. Summers. I always want to thank all the participants, all of our staff, thank the board members, members of the public, and I'm sure some staff from the Department of Energy. I appreciate people taking the time on a Friday morning and a Friday afternoon to tune in. We, I think, did our best to execute this transparently under the circumstances. And I hope that we will continue to focus on our path forward on this recommendation. At the end of the day, as you and Ms. Connery have said, our goal is to support the department in ensuring it executes its missions with adequate protection of the workers and the public. And that's the focus of the recommendation that was topical in this session and in the processes that we go through that Congress mandated. So I thank everyone. I did learn some information. I appreciate the staff's work, and thank you, sir. Those are the end of my comments.
Thank you very much, Ms. Roberson. Ms. Connery, your closing remarks, ma'am?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Roberson, and to the staff for a great interaction, a great meeting. The slide decks were great, but more importantly, your presentations were educational, not just for us, I hope, but for those watching, particularly those who had questions about what all this meant. Y'all have a second career as professors if you would like to move on, but not yet, because we still need you. I do want to say with regards to something Ms. Roberson touched on and Mr. Summers touched on it as well, it's that there's nothing that this board believes, and I'll speak for the board because I know that it's true, that the department doesn't take safety into consideration or doesn't have safety as foremost in their mind. But they also have to consider mission. They have many other things on their mind, a much bigger budget than we do, and a lot more staff to take care of, and a lot more equities to weigh. So your job is more difficult for ours because we have the luxury of only looking at the safety aspects. And so I'm hoping that the departments and the contractors and all of you who work across the complex every day to make sure that we have a safe, secure, and effective deterrent and adequate cleanup of the department's environmental programs, that you recognize that we absolutely value the work that you have, but allow us, who have the luxury of only looking at safety, to provide advice in order to make that work easier and more effective and safer for all involved, to include your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers, and the environment in which you live. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Connery. And again, thank you, Ms. Roberson. I'll now provide my closing remarks. I sincerely appreciate the Herculean effort that the entire board and board staff, superstars, have put into conducting the board's first ever virtual public meeting. Not an easy task, and you did it superbly. Thank you. I also thank our staff members as well as members of the public who watched via the internet, as well as the elected officials and their staffs who were able to watch. This concludes the public meeting of the Defense Nuclear Facility Safety Board. We are now adjourned.